Obama said, and this is a quote, "Last month I went to Andrews Air Force Base and I welcomed home some of our last troops to serve in Iraq. Together we offered a final proud salute to the colors under which more than 1 million of our fellow citizens fought and several thousand gave their lives. We gather tonight knowing that this generation of heroes has made the United States safer and more respected around the world." Really? These words were spoken by a candidate who won the 2008 election in large part due to the perception that he was the anti-war candidate and particularly opposed to the Iraq War. This tells us something very important. We know that the election of Barack Obama had great historical significance. It broke a 220-year string of only white, well-to-do or rich Northern European descended males being able to occupy the highest office in the land. That is historically significant. But we also know that the job that he took over has a job description and a title. And that title, if we were to be honest, is CEO of the empire. In fact, the war in Iraq largely destroyed a country that posed no threat whatsoever to the United States. Millions of Iraqis were killed, wounded, or forced into exile. A quarter of the population was killed, wounded, or displaced. And its society was torn to shreds, and it has not recovered from it today. We believe that it will in the future, but the damage has been very great. Not only did thousands of U.S. soldiers die in a war fought on entirely false pretenses, hundreds of thousands more suffered severe physical and psychological wounds. The total cost of the war is predicted will exceed $3 trillion. That's $3 million. It's worth mentioning that $1 trillion could put 20 million people to work for a year at $50,000 salary each. Neither in his State of the Union message nor in any of his other major, any of the other major political leaders' speeches about the withdrawal of most U.S. troops from Iraq was there any mention whatsoever of the indescribable suffering of the Iraqi people. A people whose history and culture stretches back thousands of years. The war, conducted with bombs and blockades, really began not 9 years ago, but on August 6, 1990, when at the U.S. behest, the UN Security Council voted to implement the most total blockade on any country in history. And we'll hear more about that later in this program, something that's been so ignored by the media. Since November, what we have heard through the corporate media is triumphalist propaganda about what happened in Iraq. That Iraq is now on some road to democracy, that we are all safer here, etc., ad nauseum. In December, when he announced the troop withdrawal, President Obama said, quote, "Iraq's future will be in the hands of its own people," end quote. As if to say that the occupation had been kind of a training session for the Iraqi people in self-government. In reality, Iraq had been an independent country for 45 years, from 1958 to 2003, after kicking out the British colonizers in a sweeping revolution, and was one of the most economically and socially advanced countries in the Arab world prior to the 1991 war. It also needs to be said that the propaganda statements make it seem that the United States won this war. But while it left behind a trail of death and destruction, it was no victory. Another quote from President Obama's UN speech, or State of the Union speech. "America remains the one indispensable nation in world affairs, and as long as I'm president, I intend to keep it that way." Reminiscent of Madeleine Albright in the 1990s. It's important for us to challenge this thoroughly false, chauvinistic, and racist version of reality and history. It's important not only out of concern for justice for the people of Iraq and for the soldiers who were pawns in yet another imperialist war, but it's important for the future as well. This totally dishonest presentation of the Iraq War, and also, I should say, equally so, of the Afghanistan War, is meant to make the next war, the next intervention, all the easier to sell to the people. The whole dominant narrative must be challenged and exposed for the web of malicious lies that it is. And that is what today's teach-in is really about. The United States poses as the great defender of human rights and democracy in the world today. U.S. officials continuously rant on about how leaders of other countries, certain other countries, should be charged as war criminals and dragged to the International Criminal Court at The Hague, put on trial for their alleged offenses. Of course, this is the same International Criminal Court that the United States refuses to join on the forthright grounds that their soldiers or personnel could be subject to the court if they commit crimes. The U.S. imposes sanctions and demands that the United Nations Security Council impose even harsher sanctions on targeted countries, sanctions that are deliberately designed to inflict the greatest damage on the populations of those countries. We will see more dramatic evidence of what the impact of the sanctions was on Iraq. And when the sanctions don't achieve their aim, they turn to more overtly violent means of war, covert action, assassinations, bombing, invasion. And they threaten, and we have to be honest about this, the greatest violence of all, nuclear war. This is no exaggeration. How many times have President Obama and his Republican opponents in the upcoming election this year repeated that they, quote, take no options off the table, unquote, in dealing with Iran? That is an unvarnished, open threat to attack Iran with nuclear weapons. And it is, by the way, a violation of international law and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is so often invoked against others, that the United States applies to these other countries, that no nuclear power under the treaty can threaten, and it is in violation of international law if it does threaten a non-nuclear power with the use of nuclear weapons. But never mind, we all know that international law is just for punishing poor countries and developing countries. It's amazing who doesn't have to face international law in the criminal court. The threat of nuclear attack for Iran, and we should think about this from their point of view, is not something far away. Sitting right off the coast of Iran, which everyone knows has no nuclear weapons, are U.S. Trident submarines, each one capable of launching more than 300 independently targetable nuclear warheads. Sitting right off their coast. Imagine it the other way around, right off San Francisco Bay. And what are Washington's real aims in the region? Is it to spread democracy and human rights and women's rights, like they say? That, of course, is a bad joke. Their closest client states in the Gulf region are all hereditary police state monarchies, political structures that are relics of the feudal past, and which have been kept in place by who? By the government of the United States. Like Saudi Arabia, which has no parliament, no Congress, no ever in history a real election, and where women are not even allowed to drive cars. The real aim is complete domination of this oil-rich and strategic region. And to achieve that objective, U.S. policy aims to destroy all the independent governments and popular movements that they cannot force to their knees. That's the real policy. It doesn't matter about, from Washington's point of view, about the internal dynamics of those countries, except where they can make use of them for propaganda. That is what, that real aim is what explains the 22 years of relentless war against Iraq, the 33 years of war against Afghanistan, the 65 years of war against the Palestinian people, the sanctions and threat of war against Iran, the sanctions and threat of intervention in Syria, the all-out support for Israel. And we could give, if we had time, dozens of examples of this, of over the last 60 years. Today's teach-in will be educational, informative, and oriented toward what we can do to resist war and occupation and injustice, as Reverend Callenday was referring to at the beginning. We hope everyone will stay to hear all of the speakers and to participate in the discussion period that follows. And I want to close by welcoming Ramsey Clark, who just came in the door. Thank you.